This is Permissionless Liberty.
Welcome to Permissionless Liberty. I'm Dan Sanchez with Adam Knott. How are you doing, Adam?
Fine, Dan.
So, Adam, what does permissionless liberty mean to you?
It's pretty simple. It comes from the idea that, or the question whether we as libertarians, if we plan to have a libertarian society at one point, whether that should come about by means of us persuading our fellow non-libertarian fellow citizens, persuading them to allow us to have liberty, or whether that is actually not likely to occur, that whether there's a different way that we should think about bringing about a libertarian society. And I can give you two concrete examples, and they're kind of they're kind of trivial because when you think about them, you say, well, yeah, that happened, but is that how we're going to do it? But an easy example is if we look at the last century, and if you consider that that the West was somewhat free and the United States was a free country, relatively speaking, and there was a worldwide communist movement afoot, at least that's my interpretation, including the Soviet Union and communist China. And if you had approached them and said, well, listen, other countries, we're all citizens of the world, and we would like to ask whether you would allow us to be free. We see where you want to go. We see the direction you want to go towards a government-run society, but we'd like to ask your permission to be a free society. And obviously, they would have said, well, no, we will not allow you to do that. So the point in using that kind of a goofy example is that we were free, let's say relatively free, of the restrictions that were being imposed in those societies, not because that they were okay with it or because they said, well, let's all be reasonable, let's allow that. It was just because it was impractical for them to stop us. So we were free not due to persuasion, not due to the education that we had imparted on them to allow freedom to exist. We were free because the impracticality of the people who didn't want freedom to stop it from occurring. So that's what permissionless liberty means to me. And another wonderful example that's more recent is the example of Bitcoin. And as those familiar with the history of Bitcoin will know, the inventor of Bitcoin, Satoshi Nakamoto, worked on his project basically in secrecy. And I'm pretty sure that he knew that what he was doing would not be approved by the authorities. And so what Satoshi Nakamoto did was he posted his white paper, his idea, and then he launched his program, and then he contacted some people who were like-minded, which we can maybe come back to that. And basically, he and the early miners, Hal Finney or whoever else was involved with that, the cypherpunks, started to mine Bitcoin. And they didn't ask permission. They just started to mine Bitcoin. So if Satoshi had, as opposed to what he actually did do, if he had gone to the authorities and said, well, listen, I'm thinking of introducing a decentralized currency that one day will start to will give independence to all the people who hold it from governments, will be very hard to confiscate, will be very hard to inflate, will be very hard to censor. So would you guys be okay with that? Will you allow me to do that? Will you give me permission? And the answer,
it also reminds me of the rise of ride-sharing apps. So when Uber first started out, it was a completely new category, and there were like regulations on taxis and all sorts of other regulations, and so it wasn't clear what they were about to do, what regulation it even fell under. And if they had asked for permission before just starting up, of course they would have been denied. Of course, the bureaucrats would have said, like, we don't even understand that, but that's illegal. That's not within our framework. Um, but they just started. They just launched the app, started taking customers, and by the time regulators had caught up and seen it on their radar, it was too late because it was a fait accompli that there were already so many people who were getting benefit from it that if they had just killed it with regulation, there would have been an uproar over it. And then basically they had won a freedom just through action. And of course now since then it's become regulated, but that's how it started.
Yeah, well, great. So that's exactly right. That's the another analogy or example of that. So, so as libertarians, that I don't think. Well, I know kind of what stopped us from probably doing that in our field, but I think we need to give more thought to that because um, uh, I don't think, and I know we'll talk about this in the future about education and so forth, but if we just assume for a second that what would stop people from allowing things is their own self-interest, saying, well, if I allow them to do that, then I have an established situation myself, and I can see that might erode that. So therefore, I'm not going to allow that. So you could see how it's really a human nature issue of people um, looking at their own interests and saying, well, I don't want you doing that, So any new invention, the light bulb or the the internal combustion engine is going to um, revise the relationships in society, and we shouldn't pretend that we don't understand that. In other words, libertarians should be totally upfront about that. That it, if libertarians were able to get freedom, it is going to shift. It's going to change society, because um, that will start to that would mean that the requirements there would be less requirements on libertarians. So that would start to drain, let's say, certain support for certain structures erode. Even if in my own personal libertarian thought, I have no intentions of any animosity towards any other social system. But it doesn't matter what my intentions are. The fact of the matter is that if I were allowed, or if I were able to gain freedom from other systems, that's one less person who's going to be contributing to those systems.
So I'd like to know how you came to these ideas, like your intellectual evolution, even going all the way back to when you first started thinking about liberty, about social systems. How old were you when you first started thinking about those things?
Well, thanks for asking. Well, I mean, going back, my father was an individualist, and I think there's different approaches different ways you can approach libertarianism. But mine was probably largely due to my father, who was an individualist. And an individualist is just tends to be a person who believes has convictions and believes that they're right usually, or in other words, that they don't want to be overruled by society, let's say, or by groups. And so a great example of that is Ayn Rand. My dad had an Ayn Rand book in his bookshelf, and Ayn Rand's a famous individualist. So individualism, has a bad name because it's associated with selfishness, meaning the concern with oneself to the detriment of other people. And there
Well,
can
and
be some.
Ayn Rand actually embraced selfishness as a virtue, right?
She wrote a book, and the name was the Virtue of Selfishness, which was I'm sure meant to be provocative. So that was my beginning, and And then I went, I did go to college. And when I went to the college in the late 70s, early 80s, college was already extremely left. We had two campuses where I went. You had the side of campus that was the hard sciences, which was tend to be more modern, wasn't politically oriented, but the other side, which all the social sciences and the arts, was very left back. And that's over 40 years ago. So that's nothing new. That's always been that way. Maybe it wasn't as much as it is now, but it was that way already. The classes were they were indoctrination. They weren't education. Political Science 101 was basically, they would coach you in the essays how to come out to the conclusion that Nixon was a bad, all the bad things that Nixon did, for example, whether he did or not. But that, it wasn't think about this and critically examine and come up with your own opinion. That was not it. It was basically you had to come up with the right answer, quote unquote.
So from there, right. So when you started college, would you already have considered yourself a libertarian?
No, because I didn't even know what it was. So I think what happened was, I think my recollection is I don't remember being involved in politics. Of course, when you grow up in a household, as you know, your parents' politics have to influence you. So I'm sure I was on the right side of the aisle, but I guess, but not a libertarian, because my dad was a rightist and not a libertarian. He'd be more of a strict, more of a typical rightist, meaning he just would believe force is a fact of human relationships. I'm right, so therefore force should be utilized on my side. So I'm not comfortable with that. I'm not comfortable, and I don't want to get into too deep in the weeds on that, but that's just doesn't, my temperament isn't that way, that I'm have an aversion to force.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I had that, and probably partially from living with him, because he was a forceful person, figuratively and literally. And I didn't enjoy necessarily that aspect of his personality, let's say.
So when you encountered leftists on campus, did you see them as advocates of force, but just for different purposes?
I think that's getting further along in libertarian philosophy than I was at the time. It was more that they were telling me that I was wrong, and whatever my convictions were wrong. I was on the right side of the aisle. And when in college in the social sciences, they were saying, well, that's not how we roll here. These are the answers you need to give. We're teaching, I'll give you an example how steeped it was. I remember clearly that in our art department in our college, there was a class called Sandinista poster art. And the teacher would cry because he loved it so much. This was art.
That was the name of the course?
Sandinista poster art. Yeah, so basically revolutionary art.
What it said in
specifically
the
of
course catalog?
Oh, yeah, and this is 1980, 81.
Gosh.
So this is, what we're going through with DEI and all that and all. I mean, it's been going on for a long time. So, but I wasn't a libertarian in the sense that I was analyzing it in terms of libertarian concepts. It was just that there was no corresponding, fundamentalist Christian art of the 1760s. There was no corresponding art class. So then you just knew that the whole thing was set up in a certain direction. It was just a very direct feeling of, okay, well, these guys they don't like me, and I'm not sure I like them. It was more that. The philosophy didn't come till I started to read Ayn Rand, let's say in about 1984. And as you know, Ayn Rand's very morally certain. She has moral clarity. So anybody who's looking for kind of clarity of thought, she's selling that. She has clarity of thought. It is moralism, which is not my philosophy, but when you're young and you're looking for clarity, you look for somebody who's not going to be wishy-washy, somebody who's going to actually take a stand and be clear. And she's very clear. She's not afraid to say anything. So that's very attractive to a young person who's looking for answers, or to ground their philosophy and try to find certainty in life, as opposed to everything's not certain, everything's wishy. Because what happens is when you're a kid, you're certain. because it's just the way you're born. Like my daughter's that way. She's very certain about things. And I remember I was so certain as a kid. The greatest example of that is, you ever heard the Chicago song Saturday in the Park?
Yes.
Okay. It's a famous song. And I remember arguing with my friends one time, and I was certain that that song was about Central Park because I happen to love Central Park. Now, how I arrived at that certainty, I have no idea. It was terrible in retrospect. But at the moment, I was 100% certain. And I was going to argue to the death with no evidence. So the certainty of childhood, but then eventually when that gives way, when your certainty of childhood gives way, I felt it inside because I knew my mind wasn't clear. And I started to have interesting, I've never been a person who suffered depression, but I had what I think was depression, which had to do with my mind not being very settled. So I started to look for the fix. I started to look for a solution. And I wasn't going to look for it in medication. I was going to look for it in I started to look for ideas. So I was grasping, how can I get more mental stability or mental clarity instead of just being left in the wind and ups and downs. So Ayn Rand helped me with that. And then Ayn Rand actually led to Ludwig von Mises. She mentioned him in one of her books. And that's how I was introduced to his writings. And as you know, he's the analytical philosopher. And I love analysis. And so between the two of them, then I got, then I was kind of like found, well, I think I kind of like this stuff. This is kind of, I didn't really, when I was younger, I went into the clothing business because when I said, well, what do I like to do? I had only, my dad used to, I don't mention before, my dad used to make me shine the shoes when I was a kid. When he'd go out to fancy dinners or whatever, I'd shine the shoes. So I started to like clothing a little. So whenever I'm embarking on something, I always try to connect it to myself. Well, what do you like? What do I like to do? So Ayn Rand and von Mises, when I started to read their writings, I really got, this is good stuff. I'm not a musician, I'm not a chef, not a coder, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not going to be a doctor, but this is something I like. So, and to this day, it's just, and it's been through it all. I've been really excited about libertarian related ideas. I consider Ludwig von Mises a libertarian in the very broad sense, as a pro-freedom philosopher. So when I say libertarian social thought, doesn't mean he would call himself a libertarian. It's just anybody who's interested in freedom and a free society as conceived in Western history, meaning that the government is there to enforce certain very basic rules, the night watchman government, and then leave most things up to the choice of the individual. And Mises was definitely that. So
When you read Ayn Rand, did you read just her nonfiction or her fiction as well?
no, you have to do it. It has to be when you're in that stage and you really like a writer like that. So it was first her novels. Her most important novel, in my opinion, is The Fountainhead, because the individual is the person who's looking to solve a certain problem in their life. And The Fountainhead is written from it's a first person novel about Howard Rourke, who's an architect. And so if you when I met my wife, I gave her a copy of The Fountainhead. She read it in like 2 days. She never put it down. And when I received it from a very close friend, the same thing happened to me. I read it straight through. It took like 2 days. But
what was the first? Was that the first book you read of Ayn Rand's?
Well, my dad had a book, and it was like one of her philosophical books, but I didn't understand the need for it. It's like it was too far advanced. She's talking about more morality and stuff, and I was like, well, I'm not there yet. But Fountainhead brings it back to an individual who's pursuing their goals, and society is trying to stop them. So the great function of Ayn Rand is she brought philosophical ideas in and put them in fiction form. The great battles, which and still is, collectivism versus individualism. Even if a libertarian doesn't call themselves an individualist, most likely if you're a libertarian, you're going to agree with the idea that if an individual goes over there and does something and they're not harming anyone, society shouldn't stop them. So her writing is, that's what the fountainhead is. It's saying that the creative people, like today we'd say Elon Musk would be a great example. He would have been the Howard Rourke or the John Galt of today. He's trying to go to Mars. He's trying to make robots. He's doing all these things. He would be a very Ayn Randian figure. I'm sure if they both had dinner, she'd start arguing, and dislike him, within a week. But that's because she's a moralist, and she would be very rigid in her. Anything he says could set her off. But Elon Musk was. Yeah, go ahead, Dan.
What's interesting about this is just, like you say, the power of story. That that when you have these ideas, if they're embodied and acted out by characters in an engrossing story, then it speaks to the human heart much more than a philosophical treatise could. And so I think that she has been so compelling to a lot of people because she offers both, that she kind of hooks the heart with the powerful stories, and it makes you want to follow with the mind at understanding the philosophy behind the story. And she offers not only this powerful entryway of these stories, but then she also worked out like her own personal philosophical system of objectivism, where she has something to say on everything from epistemology and to metaphysics to ethics and political philosophy. And like you said, I think it's not just you, but a lot of people, like when they're young, when they're at that formative college age, if it feels unmoored to not have a system of belief and a system of values and a system of thought. Like if you've been raised to just kind of like through osmosis just like pick up different values and thoughts, but they're not integrated into a system, then there's something that feels insecure about that. Like you feel like you don't have an accurate mental model of the world because there's so many gaps in your system of thought, and maybe there are internal inconsistencies. And like you say, like when you dive into the thought of an author, it's like, especially an author who has worked out an at least plausibly internally consistent, comprehensive system, it's so easy to just adopt that because, like, whether it's true or not, at least it's something. At least it's a system, a mental model, and then you can kind of frame your life around that. Mises isn't as comprehensive. Obviously, Mises didn't write novels, and he focused mostly on economics, although he really had a very elaborate and brilliant social philosophy in general that was connected with his economics, and a worked out philosophy of epistemology that underpinned his economics. He also had, he didn't really delve into ethics, but he had certain ethical beliefs that he talked about in his system. But he definitely is a very systematic thinker, and he changed. I didn't really get into Ayn Rand when I was young, but I later on in my late 20s, early 30s, I discovered Mises, and that was just life changing for me. Like that was a system of thought that just really made sense to me, and it was life changing for me, kind of in the same way.
Yeah, Ayn Rand, as I was saying, she writes about these. She referred to herself as a hero worshiper, and she meant that when she said that. So the Howard Rourke, who she wrote about in The Fountainhead, or John Galt. But as I was saying, Elon Musk would be a contemporary or present day Ayn Rand figure. Another great, this is just a tangent, but the movie The Matrix. I don't think people may realize, but that's kind of Ayn Rand in a sense. There's a great line there. At one point, one of the characters says, "Neo, you are the one." And I knew immediately when that this movie was something along, it reverberated with me because these individual consciousness it experiences things. And this is getting a little philosophical, but each person only has one direct experience of consciousness, or that's one approach to, that's what I would maintain. And so there is a certain thing about life where even though we try to grant to others the same consciousness experience that we have, we, in a sense, never observe their consciousness. We observe them, their bodies, and so forth. Anyway, so the Matrix, for an individualist, that movie, and then the political aspect is he's connected into a system that he has to unplug from, and he has to really assert his individuality. So that's kind of an Ayn Rand-ish type movie, an individualist type movie, even though they don't try to bring it into contemporary politics, but the metaphysics or the grounding of that movie is very individualist. Anyway, so I don't want to harp on that too much, but yeah, she was extremely influential, and that, as you said, systematic thinker, and for somebody who's lost a little bit in thought, somebody who can do that. And the way I look at Ayn Rand in my life is that if you just keep your own integrity and insist on your own judgment, that will protect you against being dogmatic. So I don't subscribe to Ayn Rand's objectivist philosophy, and for that matter, to her moral system either. I just think she was a wonderful artist, and was very influential in my life, and introduced me to other thinkers that I then went in a different direction, let's say. But it doesn't matter. You can't deny your history. She was a very important part of about 3 or 4 years of my life. And I would still give the Fountainhead to, we gave it to our daughter this year, the Fountainhead. She's taking more than a few days to get through it because she doesn't really have a need for it. She's very happy, and she still has mental certainty, even at 21. So she doesn't really have a need for it in her life right now. So it depends what your need is in life at the time you're handed a piece of art or a piece of philosophy.
So were you still in college when you did your deep dive into Ayn Rand?
No, I actually I was in California until 1984. Then I moved to New York City for 2 years, and I was working in the retail industry. And the store manager, another important person in my life, was a Randian, let's say, objectivist. And he handed me, with the first day on the job almost, I had my little suitcase, and I had my dad's Ayn Rand book in there. And then we had a certain connection, so he knew that I was somebody he wanted to hand this book to, so he handed me the Fountainhead. So in my 20s, 24 to, let's say, 26, 27, 28, 29, that's where I started to assimilate ideas and put them together and start to really assimilate. So that's where I did most of my reading, and trying to, and then also, I don't know how it was with you, but also then you start to actually try to do it on your own too. You start to put some ideas together of your own and try your hand at it. I don't know, is that what how soon does it take you after reading some great inspiring things to say, get a piece of pad of paper out and try to do it yourself,
Yeah, I mean, when I first discovered Austrian economics and the works of Mises, I would try to figure out what I was reading by writing it out. You and I were both on the forums on Mises.org in the 2010s, and I started in the 2000s, just writing forum posts. I remember one of my earliest posts was trying to write like a bullet point, like an 11 bullet list of basically like how the business cycle happens according to the theories of Mises.
Mhm.
And so I was more just like trying to fully with my creations. I was more trying to just fully understand someone else's ideas, um, more than trying to develop my own. Um, but I would say that after like I felt after several posts and blog posts and then full length essays that would be I'd get published on Mises.org, then I sort of felt confident enough to like build on that to try to make my own conclusions about some economic point or some point about ethics. Um, so yeah, it's definitely an evolution.
Well, yeah, and their work's inspiring, and it inspires you to, either support what they're doing through getting involved, or to try to um, imitate them, let's say, or follow in their footsteps, let's say. One funny thing is when I started to get excited about writing and libertarian social theory, um, and maybe a lot of writers have this, but your first attempts are pretty bad. And also it's hard to even get your ideas out. So, and I tried for a long time, and it was just terrible. It wasn't coming out. I thought I had it. It was all bottled up. I thought I had these great ideas, and I couldn't get them on paper. So the way I eventually solved it, I was so driven. Invention is wait, necessity is the mother of invention. So the
Yeah.
way I solved it was I went and bought a little tape recorder with the tiny little cassette tapes, because I had the ideas and I just couldn't write them down. So I started talking the ideas into the tape recorder. And then when I got, a half an hour or 40 minutes worth I just transcribed it. I was talking in laundromats and stuff, I'd be doing laundry, and then I'd be talking my philosophy into the thing. And eventually I had enough material, and I just wrote it down, and then you could, maybe correct it or something. So that's how I eventually broke my writer's block. And when somebody wants something bad enough, they'll kind of figure out a way to make it happen. A funny story: Ayn Rand, the way she met her husband. Before, I want to talk about her forever, but before we leave Ayn Rand, she for part-time, for money, she was working on movie sets. I don't know if you heard about this one, but
Mm-hmm.
so to make money, she was working on movie sets, I think in Hollywood or something, California. And she saw this man who she was attracted to, basically, and she said, I have to meet this person. So in the course of their working on this movie set, she stumbled on purpose to meet him. She basically orchestrated a fall to meet him. So again, necessity is the mother of invention. And when you really want something, so she found out a way to make it happen. And Frank, I forgot his name. Frank, it's not Lloyd Wright, but Frank, I can't remember right now. But
O'Connor.
yes, Frank
Yeah.
O'Connor. Yeah, good. So anyway, so that my tape recorder was, it's like I gotta do this. I gotta do this. But so Ayn Rand, then Mises, and then this is a little advanced for people as far as scholarship, but the philosopher kind of at the root of when you go down the Austrian path, and if you really take it seriously, and you really want to go down to the thinkers that were doing work in the 20s and 30s, the teens, those years, the philosopher Husserl, who was a phenomenologist, all roads lead to him, because I believe he was the founder of a school of philosophy, phenomenology, and his function, this is my perspective. So check with your philosophy professor, or you can check with Grok or something to check me on this. But his importance to me was not in the problems that he solved or whether he solved them. It was in the framing of the problem.
Hmm.
So essentially what he said was that he said that European man, by what he meant, I think, is Western man, is in a crisis because with regard to consciousness, due to natural science, the ascent of natural science, we were unwittingly trying to apply those methods to matters of the mind.
Mm-hmm.
And he clearly formulated that as the problem that has to be solved. And so and then I, as far as I know, he tried to set upon making a foundation to solve that. I tried to read his philosophy and it was very difficult for me. It was a dead end for me, but I agreed with his framing of the problem. And to this day, he's an influence on my work, even though I hardly know anything about his philosophy except for his framing of the problem. So he's at the root of Austrian thought, one of the people. Mises in
Yeah.
a very, go ahead.
Methodological dualism is what Mises called it.
Oh, yes.
The contention, like what Husserl, you're saying, said that the natural sciences, that a different method is proper to the natural sciences than
Yes.
than there is to the to social sciences and to the
Yes.
sciences of human action.
Yeah. An easy way for a beginner or an intermediate person to understand it is very simple. If you deal with events from the point of view of time separation, event 1, tick, 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 time, event 2, you could say now you're in the world of natural science. If you deal with things in the form of mathematics, where there's no time separation, 2 times 2 equals 4 times 1 equals. It's what Hayek called the system of tautologies. When there's no time separation, there's a whole body of thought that doesn't deal with time separation, that deals with the implications of ideas. So methodological dualism would just be the contention that, well, how are you going to treat that? You see this thing over there? How are you going to treat it? Are you going to treat it with mathematics? Or are you going to do an experiment? One observation, tick, 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 time, the second observation. It's 2 methods. They're not the same, not identical. Mathematics is not identical to natural science, not identical. So there's 2 methods. And Mises claimed that the method appropriate to social science was the analytical method, as I would call it, the method absent, without time separation. People would take issue with that. But anyway, he would call it an analytical method that is the opposite to the method of natural science. So yes, method. So a method for doing this, there's a method for studying nature, and there's a method for studying the relationship of ideas. And he claimed that you could study human behavior on this analytical method.
Mm-hmm.
So he set a framework, or he set a goal to anybody who would agree with him, to study what he called human action, just means the things that we do, through that other method, akin to mathematics, or he would say also formal logic. I don't know a lot about formal logic, but to the extent that that's a connection of ideas, that, there's symbolic notation, but it's a connection of ideas. So I always use just, as I said, 4 times 6 equals 2 times 12 equals 24 times 1.
So when you were doing your tape recorder philosophizing, was that after you had studied Mises, or in between Rand and Mises?
It's probably during.
During.
But one thing I'll say real quick on that is that when somebody who starts in social philosophy, it's only natural that you take the ideas
I
that
see what you did there.
Oh yeah, it's only natural. Well, yeah, maybe, and yeah, it's only natural that you take the ideas that you're familiar with and you start to work with them. So what a beginning social theorist will do is take the ideas of natural science, because we all agree there's such a thing called time. There's a thing called motion. There's a thing called an environment. There's a thing called an object. So you take these ideas, and my early social theory was called, one of my first completed essays, which I'm kind of proud of actually, but I wouldn't put it out there as my big achievement, was called The Object and the Medium. And it was the idea was that you had an object in it like in a fluid, and that when you shape the object to fit one fluid, it would misshape it to go to a different fluid. So it was basically saying, anyway, but what I'm trying to say is that you start off with physical concepts, and that ends up being a mistake because the social issues, as I would argue, require a different framework, and the physical concepts are a trap. And so, but it's not easy to overcome that, because what other concepts are there? In other words, if I said, well, start, I don't know if you remember well, I don't want to get too, let's do that for later, but beginning social theorists, it's common that they'll use a lot of physical ideas because that's what's in our culture. We all have been to classes where we've been taught about velocity, acceleration. We all know just from living, there's such a thing as high and low, fast and slow, dark and light. So these are all concepts that are just around us, and we don't see that any other way to start to frame the problem than using those concepts. And once we do, we inadvertently start doing physics, because those are physical concepts. And people, I think that's widely not understood. So people are engaged in doing physical theory who intend to be doing social theory, and that's why their theory eventually peters out, because those theories, physics has its boundaries and limitations and structure, and it can't get to what you're trying to get to, or we are trying to get to, in what we're trying to do on the social side. Those concepts aren't made to do that. They are made to study one event, time, tick, 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 another event. So anyway, Husserl was the philosopher who said, here's the problem. So who wants to try to solve that? And it's not an easy problem.
So your early interests were focused on epistemology and the methods of the sciences.
Well, what happens is, as when you read Mises, eventually you get deeper and deeper. One of his greatest books is The Ultimate Foundation of Economic Science, which I think he wrote after his 80th birthday, as Roderick Long had written in an introduction. So if you read him, he will bring you to epistemology, and he uses that word quite a bit. And for those who are listening, what epistemology has to do with knowledge. Okay. And there are different ways we can obtain knowledge. Okay. So, and this, we'll throw something out here that's kind of philosophical, but it's kind of still beginner level. So, the one way you can obtain knowledge is from another person telling you something. And a second way you can get it is by, let's say, making an observation. That would be a way of getting knowledge. So I'm going to go look at the back of that mountain and see what's over there. Now I'll have knowledge about that. Or someone can tell me what's in the back of that mountain. But there's a third way, that's the way that's kind of been overlooked and kind of dropped. But what some of the social scientists said in the 1930s was, well, let's suppose that our mind is structured in a certain way. If we could figure out the structure of our mind, that might tell us some important things about our knowledge, because we would know that all our knowledge has to be of a certain structure. And so they tried to grapple with that for a time. And as far as I know, they eventually said, well, we don't know how to do that. We don't know how to grasp the categories or structure of our mind such that we could predict the structure that something has to appear to us in a day from today, we don't know how to do that. But when you read Mises, he talks about mental categories all the time. And Hayek made some very famous, Friedrich Hayek made some very, very famous passages in which he expressed that same idea, that by understanding our own mind, the structure of our mind, we could perhaps understand social reality. But what happened, I think just historically, the world, as you know, the world was heading towards Keynesianism in economics and more towards greater statism in politics. And it just swamped, and then natural science for knowledge. And as Husserl said, no matter how high the tide rises, he said, I'm right, no matter how high that this tide rises, but the tide was just gigantic, and it just dwarfed everything. So naturalism, statism, and Keynesian economics were just because the world was wanting those things. So the world brought what it wanted, which was greater government involvement, and it wasn't the time to follow these strands of thought that were not solving the problem that the world wanted solved, which was how to administer a modern state.
Right.
Because when the Austrians proposed their economics, if you were to follow them, they don't promise you how to get greater control over an administrative state. That's not what they're solving. They're trying to solve towards greater human happiness, which is consistent with a state dissolving into other forms, with evolution that wouldn't guarantee the existence of a modern state. Well, 100 years ago, and even today, nobody that we know that is in power is interested in that, of a natural evolution based on knowledge, where the outcome is indeterminate, not determined. It's based on human choice. So you would let go, if you followed Austrian economics and their prescriptions, free choices of people would lead to an evolution of society in an unpredictable direction, which I would find exciting. But I'm outvoted. So that's what happened, I think, 100 years ago, is that they were investigating systems of thought that would not guarantee the tomorrow that many people were wanting, which is a greater control over their future via government structures, security, social security, safety, certainty, whatever. Freedom doesn't guarantee those things. It has a path to those things, stability, but it does involve a certain faith. It involves because you have to let go in a certain way. So what I'm trying to say is that the thought that Mises and the very serious, let's call it Germanic philosophers, and I could be corrected on that, but Hayek, Schutz, Husserl, and some of these people, and I wonder whether Heisenberg was one of them. I don't really know. I'm not a historian of thought, but when you look at the thinking, if you read Heisenberg, the physicist, the thinking is so sophisticated. I mean, the theory that he came up with, as a layman and a non-physicist, still, I've read his popular books, and the level of intelligence is of a very analytical, high analytical nature, and that's what they were pursuing. But that wasn't what the world, because right, it wasn't socialism being introduced in the late 1800s, and many people just assumed that was the future. That was more what was in the air. That the man of today, of that day, the person in the know, knew that socialism was what was unfolding, a certain government-oriented society. So they were just when it's extinct, in a sense. This method of thinking went extinct just because of the tide of history was just too big. There's nothing they could do. They couldn't reverse that tide. It was just, that'd be like if I tried to single-handedly stop COVID lockdowns. You know, the pandemic's coming over from China. The planes are getting shut down. You know, I could have a theory about it, but I'm not going to win. I'm going to lose. You know, so it's just history. Sometimes you're just outnumbered, and you have to wait. Your ideas may not get picked up again till later. I've tried to pick up in my writing on some of those ideas that I take very seriously, and I enjoy doing that.
So after you started writing your first articles, was the Mises Institute something that you encountered shortly after, or was that much later?
Pretty soon after, because you and maybe it's the same for you, Dan. You start. There's only a few groups that are pursuing these ideas, right? There's the objectivists, there's the Austrians, and so forth. And I'm not sure when the Mises Institute. Do you remember the year that they were founded?
I think it was in the 80s, but I'm not sure exactly which year.
Yeah, so that's that's when I kind of started doing some writing. So they have newsletters or whatever, and they're having meetings out in California and the Claremont College area and around the country, and so anybody who's young and wants to start gravitate towards those ideas and stuff starts to see where they're going to be meeting, and so I started maybe going to a few of those, and I think, as we had discussed previously, maybe try to write a few articles and submit them, to Judith Thomason, the one of the libertarian editors of her time.
It was 1982
Wow.
when Mises was founded.
Yeah. So they did a great service because they served as a rallying point for people of like-minded, libertarians who were oriented towards economics, which a lot of libertarians are. And so I had some small contact with them, and I ended up actually giving a talk there one day around 2001 or something like that, and flew out there and gave an early version of a theory I've been working on. And one thing while we're on the subject, I wanted to just say, for maybe, hopefully you agree, but when you're doing libertarian philosophy, there's two general large approaches. One is what you could call normative, as opposed to analytical. The other way that's described is prescriptive versus descriptive, right? So you can either say, well, I just want to describe how this works in general. I don't want to take sides. I just want to describe how human nature is and human social interaction. So a goofy example of descriptive would be if somebody said, you can analyze everything as fear or greed. That's a very oversimplified philosophy, saying everything can be described in terms of fear and greed. It's not making a moral statement. It's saying either somebody's afraid of something and they're doing it because they're afraid of it, or they're greedy and they're doing it because they want to get something. So there's a descriptive approach, and that's what von Mises's praxeology is, which is just describing human nature, what he calls human action, and saying, well, if this is true, then this will be true as well, because those two things are connected. So going back to the mathematical, non-time separated connections, the formal implications or the equations of human life. And the other one's prescriptive. It's basically saying, well, tomorrow you probably won't do X, but I think you should do X. So prescriptive means coming up with norms that people may or may not do. And usually when we do that, we usually have our own prejudices or advice. Like if I'm arguing to somebody to stop demonizing someone, let's say, I said, you shouldn't, if we want to get where we're going, we shouldn't demonize other people. We should try to educate them. Let's say that. That is prescriptive. It's saying, well, the best way to get this done with these other people, I think, is to be nice to them. And somebody says, no, you got to be hard on these people. They only respect power. So now we're talking about normative. We're talking about what's the best way to do this. There's no mathematics of this. This is something where I'm going to make a judgment, and then I'm going to advocate for that judgment that I made, knowing that there's no mathematics of it. It's just I feel strongly about my judgment that this is the path, and there's no proof of that. You can't prove a value, and and any philosopher should try that. Like, I strongly believe, when I was a kid, and even I might strongly believe that Frank Sinatra is a better singer than Tony Bennett. So that's my value. So try to prove it. Get a piece of paper out and try to prove that Sinatra is a better singer than Tony Bennett. And I'm telling you what's going to happen. You won't be able to do that without coming up with a goal, because if you say it's better, then the question comes up, better for what? And then you have to answer better. So it comes to be means and ends. And then you realize, oh, so it's not that he's better. It's only if I want this certain thing, maybe that will get it. So you could see when you start doing that, you start to learn what Mises was preaching is that you start out with a moral conviction, but if you follow the logic of it, you actually can't prove the value you set out to prove. You end up doing means and ends. You end up doing analysis. And so any advanced social theorist has to go through that stage of first trying to prove a value, and then realizing, by being honest with themselves, because I'd be happy to prove it. I mean, if I have things that I strongly believe, and I'd love to be able to prove them, but I have been unable to do so. And I have not seen anybody who has been able to do so. So there's that in that circumstance, there's a very important lesson of social theory. So the quicker one learns that lesson and doesn't fight that lesson, says, I'm never going to be able to prove a value. I'm only going to be able to prove that for this end, this means is appropriate or not appropriate. The sooner somebody can get to that in their own mind, the better, because you could spend years trying to prove a value, and you're probably going to lose.
Yeah, so that was a debate that you and I were having with others on the Mises forums, because I was also very much convinced by Mises's utilitarianism, and so he agreed with David Hume that you can't derive an ought from an is, that you can't derive what you call the prescriptive from the descriptive, and so and he saying everything that you said in terms of coming down to means and ends, and whether a certain means is good or bad depends on the ends that you're aiming at. But what Mises believed was that, for the most part, everyone in society has the same general ends, that we all prefer wealth to poverty and health to sickness, and he believed that the social system, and the social system under liberty in particular, was the best means to all of our ends. And so that he really thought of economics as a value-free science, and he thought of, like, all sciences as value-free science. So he didn't really think of a science of ethics where you could, like, prove that something is wrong or right, but you could prove to people that, like, okay, well, given your ends, those ends would be best served through the means of a free society, basically. And Murray Rothbard disagreed with that Murray Rothbard really believed in natural law ethics, and so his ethics of liberty really taught that, and a lot of the Mises Forum people were Rothbardians in that regard. So you and I
Yeah.
would debate them about that. How was it that you first discovered the Mises Forums?
Wow. Good question. Well, I did have some relationship through business dealings with Lou Rockwell and Jeff Tucker. And I
You
think it was
provided
just,
them shoes, right?
yep, I was a retailer of men's shoes and a famous brand, and that both of them wore. It was one of the top made American brands of shoes. And it's a funny thing that I think Jeff only bought one shoe from me, and it was my very best one. I had a famous shoe at one point that our store had designed, and it kind of was it was almost world famous actually. And Jeff bought that one shoe from me. Lou, I think, bought more standard models or whatever. But I think when you have an organization that's basically at the epicenter of a certain movement, let's say, and they are the premier organization, that's where talent will gravitate toward. And I'm sure I just gravitated towards their website when websites became 1994, 95, 96, 97. So websites came into being, and then I'm not sure when the forum started. But that's when I started accumulating some web domains. I mean, you may or may not. I have praxeology.com and praxeology.org. And I was fortunate enough to get my own name as well, adamknott.com, and I have a few others. So I think it was just natural that you find their website, and then the forum is a place. The Mises Forum was a discussion forum for libertarians, especially those interested in Austrian economics. And what that provides you, of course, is a platform for your ideas, because your ideas will get seen and read, and also a place where ideas can get criticized, which is in the short term, it's not fun, but in the long term, it's very good. And also, as much as I didn't go there to say, teach me something, I already thought I knew everything, of course. But when you're being contradicted, oftentimes they'll send you the passage that somebody said had written, a famous author or something. So you will actually learn, even if you weren't trying to. Because if I'm interacting with somebody on a forum, and they say something which I know, and they say, "Well, I believe in Mises," and I can see that they're saying something that Mises doesn't agree with, I'll send them the passage, so they're going to learn. And that's how I learned as well. People would say, "Well, what about this?" And they'd post something. So you get an audience, you get critiqued, and your ideas get critiqued, which is good in the long run, and you learn. So it was amazing few years that we had there. I mean, even with you, I mean, I think it even helped launch your career, maybe. And your Lilburn articles were more, though, not necessarily on the forums, I guess, but I guess more the publishing opportunities that the Mises enterprise offered. They're scooping up young talent and giving a
Yeah.
platform for young talent, right, to prosper and to develop, right?
Yeah. So Jeffrey Tucker really masterminded an amazing suite of offerings on Mises.org. And so when I was going through my intellectual journey and first learning about libertarianism, I was following different blogs and I would check out different libertarian websites. But then once I found Mises.org, it really systematically introduced me to the systems of thought of Mises and Rothbard, and because Rothbard's another very systematic thinker, and so this whole like Austro anarcho libertarianism that Mises was making available to people, it was just like instantly made sense to me, and I just kind of just adopted that as my paradigm. And it was because they had such a rich um, offering for self-study, because they had Mises daily articles on, and so these were just like articles commenting on the news from an Austro-libertarian perspective, and they would often cite Mises and Rothbard, and then there was just their library of books by Mises and Rothbard and the whole libertarian tradition. So they had a really elaborate bookstore, and I bought a whole bunch of books that I still have on my bookshelf today and just read them cover to cover. And then they also had ebook versions of them and audiobooks. And so I just became obsessed with just learning Austrian economics. And so I also gravitated to the forums because that's where fellow students of Austro-Libertarianism were um, talking about what they were learning about and sharing what they were learning about. And so, it was just so great to be able to just create a forum account. The community platform also had a blogging platform where you could start your own blogs. So I would like write write blog posts on the community blog on Mises.org, and then I'd share them in the forum, and I'd discuss them with people. And a lot of times the blog posts were about something that I was reading by Mises or Rothbard or Karl Menger or some other Austrian economist. And and yeah, eventually that led to my one of my blog posts getting picked up by Jeffrey and published as a Mises Daily.
Mhm.
And so I just it was kind of like just this huge hobby for me of just writing Mises Daily articles and participating in the forums and eventually moderating the forums. And then and so when a part-time job opportunity came up, I was pretty qualified for it because of all the learning and writing that I had done. And so I helped launch the Mises Academy, the first online learning platform about for liberty in the movement. And eventually that part-time job um, led to an opportunity to work full-time for the Mises Institute. So I worked full-time running the academy, but also as the editor. Um, and then yeah, since then I went to Fee, where I am now, and Fee is actually kind of the first organization of the kind that the Mises Institute is, because Fee was founded in 1946 and actually hired Mises. Like Mises, Ludwig von Mises himself was on the staff of
Wow.
Fee, and and then since then, so that was kind of like the mothership, or kind of like the initial model of, later. Then the next year in 47, Hayek founded the Mont Pelerin Society, and then you know the also since then just so many libertarian think tanks have sprung up.
Well, yeah, when the Mises Institute was, as you're describing, it's kind of taking all this young talent and people who are very motivated. And what Jeffrey had going there, Jeffrey Tucker had going there was, I don't want to say it was decentralized, but it was neat that there seemed to be opportunities for people to find a niche and maybe be able to ascend, in the things that they're interested in. And it was a special time when Jeffrey Tucker was there, a well-known editor in the libertarian movement, or as I would say, the editor of the libertarian movement, even to this day, probably. So everybody has their role he has a very important role in our movement with the Brownstone Institute that he started during the COVID controversies. Hume, you mentioned Hume when we were talking, and such an important figure. When you sometimes when a philosopher poses a rule in the form of a negative that you can't do this, it serves as it really serves can serve as a positive. In other words, if a negative rule is like you can't derive an is from an ought, that if that holds, then it tells you something about the structure of what the thing you're dealing with. The same thing Heisenberg did in physics with his uncertainty principle. You can't know the momentum or the velocity at the same time. Also, Hume had something to say about the idea of necessity. And in social science, necessity is a very important concept, whether everything is probable and may or may not happen, or whether there's certain things that have to happen. If X happens, Y has to happen, or is everything such that if X happens, Y may or may not happen? So empiricism versus necessity. And Hume had some very important things to say about that. So Hume is one of the names that if you participate in social science, you can't avoid it. You have to meet him, and you have to know one or two important things that he said. If you never do that, then you're going to be tripping over yourself, because you're never going to grapple with certain laws that he was able to formulate. He was a genius, basically. And the funny story about him is, as that, everybody probably knows who does a little history, but I think he wrote an earlier version of his famous book on human understanding, and it went nowhere. It was a total dud. And he wrote something about that. Remember, it fell stillborn from the press without so much as a murmur from the demagogues or something, or dogmatists or something. It was this beautiful phrase that he came out with his gem, and he couldn't even get the dogmatist to even comment on it. And it was just, and then he went back and rewrote the whole thing, as far as I know. So it's like, man, talk about being driven.
Well, I'm not sure if this is what you were going to say, but I'm really interested on what you were writing about in your own writings and then on the forums. Like from that point, like how have your ideas changed? Like your ideas about social philosophy, but also your ideas about social change. Like how different were those ideas from the ideas you have now about permissionless liberty, and how did that change happen?
Well, when if you start getting involved in it, and if you're an earnest person, and I consider myself that, a sincere person, then means you're honest, and then that means when you look at the thing you're doing, are you achieving that? Have you achieved that? Are you achieving that? And so with me, I always know whether I'm achieving what I set out to achieve. And so if you have a goal and you know in your heart that you haven't achieved it, that prompts you to redouble and rethink and adjust and change and learn. So I've never had a problem with not knowing whether I had achieved what I set out to achieve. So then I always knew that it hadn't achieved that yet. And so the two theories that I work in, which is praxeology, the descriptive, and then the prescriptive, there's a lot of ways which I haven't changed, but I will just say that the main problem to be solved in libertarian social theory, the kind that you and I are both involved in, which is trying to have more liberty, and I think we've discussed this before, but that the main problem to be solved is that libertarians don't have a tangible society. In other words, all the liberties that we have are permissioned liberties. They're liberties that are granted to us by the political powers that be.
So
And
are you saying that the what you were operating under before was the notion that if you developed and shared the right social theory that would change people's minds and create social change, but then but now you, or at some point you stopped believing that? Is that what you're saying?
good question. I don't remember when I realized that 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 I when I started to realize that libertarianism wasn't working for me, or in my estimation, let me say. Not for me. I mean, for me, it's personally, you know, I'm happy with what I'm doing, but I mean, that even from the days of Ayn Rand writing about Galt's Gulch, or Rothbard's idealized society with it, where everybody has a certain ethic, however you want to visualize it, it's not happening. So I don't remember when I came to believe that there may be something structural involved. But I can tell you that figured out pretty quickly that if you have a libertarianism where you envision a certain structure of society, that there's a problem there, because I don't see how you separate libertarianism from individual choice. And any society I envision, if somebody else envisions a society, says, well, Adam, here's your place over here, go to, it's like, well, where was the choice? Where's my choice? It's supposed to. So I realized right away that a libertarian society was not something that a theorist could theorize, that it would be the libertarian society would be the end result of a number of choices that people made. So from that moment on, I knew that the pre-visualization of a structure of society was the faulty method of obtaining a libertarian society. So then the challenge is, well, what do you mean by individual choices? We're not allowed to do those things. So, but what it does is, if you know that something's a dead end, then you will not spend years or decades trying to pursue it. So then, even if you don't make much headway, whatever energy you do put in then has to go down a different road, and you can start working on that road. So, anyway, I think we'll get into these things more as we, in the future. But I just came to believe that, have come to believe that the problem that we have is, how do we form the first nascent libertarian society? How is that going to be accomplished? In other words, how do we get in it? Just like, how did Bitcoin get introduced? How are we going to do that for what we want to do? And I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying it's obvious how we should do it. But it's not primarily a scholarship issue in my mind, or an education issue. It's a structural action issue. It's like, how do I do this when society isn't going to allow me to do it voluntarily? When I can't persuade my fellow citizen to allow me to do it, can I do it? And if so, how can I do it? Because as a libertarian, you have strict rules. You can't do it through violence, which I totally accept, and I accept that wholeheartedly. I don't want to. So, okay, so that's off the table. And second, it's not going to be something that I say, well, I have a society now. Everybody else, you have to get into the structure that I just wrote about. I have a book and I've read. Can't be that. So now you start to take these big chunks and they're off the table, and you start to see how the problem is going to get very small. It's going to get very granular. And as I said, to give our readers a heads up, I mean, what I came to realize is that two people is a society. And so what ends up happening is, what's preventing a libertarian society is really not education of the public. It's more fear, because 2 or 3 people can start their own society right now and institute certain agreements between them that larger society would not allow if you asked them to do that. A simple example would be minimum wage. And we don't have to go into this deeply, but 3 people could, or 2 people could decide to have a no minimum wage between them and start working on an hourly basis and have no minimum wage. And so that would be a nascent libertarian society. Now, how long can you sustain that? How long did Bitcoin sustain when the first program got introduced before somebody might try to shut it down? So that's where my thinking's going in that direction. And I want to leave so two visuals. If somebody's trying to understand what I'm saying, is if you think about the existing society we're in, let's call it mainstream society or non-libertarian society that we live within in our historical epoch. And then supporting that is all of their scholarship. That's the New York Times. That's all of the colleges. That's all the news shows and all of the art that supports their way of thinking, which supports their political structure in the sense that they accept it and that they try to figure out ways to make it better and perfect it, let's say. And libertarians have that in scholarship, but not in a tangible form. So that's really easy to see. You see a quadrant for mainstream society, mainstream scholarship, libertarian scholarship, no libertarian society. So that's the simplest way. Another way to see it visually, to visualize it, is to think of in our current society, there's unmistakably a group of people who would like to pursue a society of more or less full government control. So they're communist socialists, Elizabeth Warren, Paul Krugman. They want to go tomorrow. They want new laws and more laws, and there's no end to it. So they want to keep going in that direction until we get to something like China, absent some of the egregious, flaws. Let's say they want to perfect the Chinese model without its, glaring inhumanities. Let's say. Okay, so that's this group, and however, whether they 10%, 20% of the population, whatever. The rest of society is what I would refer to as like 50-50 people. So they're moderates. They want 50% government and they want 50% of liberties, but each one of them wants it in a different way. I want to restrict this and allow this, and then the next group wants to restrict this and allow that. So one group wants to let all the people come across the border. One people says, no, I want to push them all back across the border. So when each one gets power, they're both in agreement on a society of interventionist society with a nice carved out set of liberties for specific people. Okay, so which that's I can live in that. I'm in that right now, and I'm doing fine. But by my point in bringing that up is that on the other side of that should be the 10 or 20% of the people who want less and less laws every week or every month with no end to that. That's me. Okay, so then someone says, well, Adam, yeah, you can be that, and Dan can be that. Great. What's wrong? Well, the 20%, they're getting laws made every week. There's a new mayor in New York. He's going to put in a new law. There's a new mayor of Seattle. She's going to have new laws. There are going to be new restrictions enacted, and tons of them in the next few weeks. The 50-50 people are going to come in and out of power. Trump's going to go out of power. Someone's going to come in. They're going to redo the 50-50. They're going to take restrictions here, relieve those, and put them in new restrictions in other places. But we, as libertarians, we're not going to have any release of restrictions on an ongoing basis because we haven't enacted any libertarian process. There's no self-sustaining or generated process of relief of restrictions on the other end, counterbalancing communism. There's 50-50 in the middle. So the whole thing's going leftward. It's lurching leftward towards more government because there's 20% of the people pulling it that way that want to go all the way. And the 50-50 people will just keep changing spaces. And so all the tug of war just keeps drifting. It's like a big cruise ship heading towards an iceberg. So you can see that our task as libertarians, as I would advocate and argue, is that we need to set that process up so that there has to be some generation of liberty somewhere. And that's I see as our job to initiate that, that our legacy would be to initiate that process and show through demonstration how that should be done. And that's a task worthy of our movement. We have the scholarship, we have the intellectuals, we have all that. What we don't have is we don't have the concrete initiation of a freedom process that, again, when I go to bed on Friday night, I know on Monday morning 20% is going to get new restrictions, and then the middle crowd's going to get in and redo some restrictions and redo some liberties and rearrange the boat on the deck of the boat, the chairs on the deck of the boat. But there's no freedoms there's no explicit freedom process on the other end. So to me, it's so clear, and I have ideas about that I'd love to cover, and as we go forward about how to do that. And I'll leave you. If we're going to close this down, I'll leave you guys with something, pretty interesting idea, and that is, if you and I didn't want to have as an example, again, these are just examples, a minimum wage between us, would we even win a lawsuit if we said the government knows? Maybe we would lose that lawsuit, but has anybody, because I'm not really interested in mainstream society doing what they want to do. So mainstream society says, well, we know what we're doing. We want to make sure everybody makes $25 an hour. Fine. So Adam, if you hire one of our people, you better pay him that. And we're going to protect him, make sure you do pay him that. Okay, I got it. But I want to know, if me and Dan make an agreement, we say, well, we're not doing that. We're not doing that. What are the legal? Because if 2 people can do it, then 3 people can do it. That's a small society right there. I'm willing to argue that debate whether it's society. Well, I actually know it is, because there is no number that has to be a society. So society it's a matter of principle. It's a matter of the agreements that people have. And so there's your libertarian society in theory, with a goofy example. It's not, maybe somebody can think of a different one, where it's a restriction that we as libertarians think, well, there shouldn't even be that restriction. So why can't we start a society that doesn't have that restriction, start with one issue and expand it to other issues? And it's not threatening my neighbor. There's no violence involved. There's no education involved. Well, there's education through demonstration. And I came up with a term. I'm probably not original, but I think the term could be peer-to-peer liberty. So basically, it's liberty between 2 people based on their agreement, just like there's peer-to-peer currencies. So it's opt-in. Nobody's forced to join any agreement.
Maybe that's what we should have called the podcast.
No, it's never too late. Peer-to-peer liberty, we can do it. We can change it.
Well, Adam, thank you for this trip down memory lane and how it led to your ideas, and thank you for the preview of your ideas that I'm sure that we will delve into deeper in future episodes. So thank you for everyone for tuning in to Permissionless Liberty. Check us out next week and follow us on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube.
Thank you, Dan. It's been a pleasure.